Hey everyone, I'm Patrick Jones, and welcome to episode 74 of That Gives Me Anxiety. Or as we'll call it, Middle-Aged Man Complains About Being Tired Hour. I'm exhausted. Played 6 games of hockey in 3 days. It's too much. It's too much. My weekly activity took over my weekend. It was just like a playoff change. So now I play on 2 teams, and they were both in the playoffs, and it used to not be over a weekend, but now it is. It was more spaced out. And yeah, there are muscles that I didn't know I had that are in a lot of pain. I mean, the best part was that, I get to play, I got to play a lot of hockey, and then I had something to complain about. Ooh, isn't it great to have something to complain about? I just did my favorite activity in the world too many times, and now my body hurts. But yeah, a lot of fun, and better now. I feel like I have a get away from working out card for a while. I started to lower my voice there because I didn't want Jamie to hear that I don't plan on working out for a while. Though just as many games I played in, I also had visits to Home Depot. They don't tell you. When you buy a house, your life just becomes maintaining and personalizing your house. Oh, now I have 2 things to complain of. Oh, how wonderful. Well, I've got a great episode lined up. It's on evictions. I got the idea for this episode after reading a book called Evictions. Let me get the author's name. Oh, it's called Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. And it talks about like the ins and outs of evictions and cyclical evictions from both like a personal story level and on the aggregate, all taking place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But yeah, it puts a lot of things in perspective, and it's really, really scary and sad and eye-opening. So yeah, definitely recommend that book. But in today's interview, I spoke with Juan Pablo Garnham from the Eviction Lab. The Eviction Lab is connected to Princeton University, where they create data, tools, and research to help neighbors and policymakers understand the eviction crisis. It's kind of wild how little information there is out there on evictions. Make no mistake about it, there's certainly an eviction crisis. There are 3.6 million eviction cases filed every year by American landlords. That's so many. Well, before I start talking to Juan, I just want to remind you, if you're liking the podcast, to please remember to rate and review it. 5 stars, I'm really enjoying this podcast line. Goes a long way. You can check the show out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Or YouTube. On YouTube, you can watch me complain in the flesh. Also, my partnership with Pure Spectrum CBD. Don't forget the promo code AnxietyPod for 15% off your order. And if you're liking the show and you want to give a tip or just say that you're really liking it and you want to help me keep making these, you can do that by clicking the Buy Me a Coffee link, which is in the description. Man, whenever I'm like really tired, I start to stutter more. Guess that makes sense. Well, yeah, I'm excited for people to listen to this interview and start thinking about evictions in a different way and how it's a major problem. So yeah, let's start talking to Juan. As always, thank you so much for listening and enjoy. Joining me now on the podcast to discuss eviction, I have Juan Pablo Garnham, who is a researcher and a journalist at the Eviction Lab. Juan, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you for this invitation.
Yeah, so the idea for discussing this with someone such as yourself came after I read the book, and I want to look up the title here. It's just called Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. Basically, for the listeners, if you haven't read this, it talks about how cyclical eviction can be damaging and goes through a lot of studies looking specifically at Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so reading that book, it was just earth-shattering. I mean, I've been lucky enough myself to not be in a position of ever being evicted, but to be able to consider what people are going through. Oh my goodness. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of discuss what your work is like and give you a chance to introduce yourself to the audience before we really dig into it.
Mhm. Yeah, so I'm a journalist and I've been working on urban affairs, housing issues, and other things that impact everyone that lives in a city, as many of us do, for a long time. So before this job, before working with Eviction Lab, I was actually working in Texas covering all sorts of things, especially what happened during the pandemic. And of course, evictions were a big part of that. And the things that you read in the book, which is so well written, so clear, and such a good mix of the emotional things that happen during an eviction, but also like the very clear facts that make it such an important moment in someone's financial journey and in the moment of poverty. All of that is things that I could see with people like in the streets of cities like Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, Fort Worth, and many more. So yeah, I got into this job and it's kind of closing a circle in a way, where now I'm working with the institution that is one of the research centers that is doing the most interesting work in that sense, in terms of evictions and the impact in everyone's lives. Yeah, and we're part of Princeton University, which is where the center is housed at. And I work with a bunch of amazing researchers that not only are creating all these databases and providing all this information that before we didn't know about. So before we didn't know what was happening in the country in terms of numbers, how big was the crisis, etc. But also like moving forward conversations and looking at more aspects that we didn't even know before that were linked to eviction. Like, for example, voting participation. Now, thanks to a paper that we published last year, we know that when someone is evicted, that decreases voting participation, your chances of going to the polls and participating, in civic life, which is a really interesting thing.
Yeah, but it makes perfect sense, right? If you don't have your basic needs being met, voting for even down the ballot elections feels so much less important, right? Until you get that figured out.
Yeah, there's certainly an issue of priority, and you might have to change your community. You might not know who are the candidates, what are the issues, but there's also like practical things, because you lose your address. You might have issues with your ID. Our researcher that worked on this paper, she actually says that there's like a bigger impact in places that make it more difficult to re-register. So places that don't have same-day registration, or that ask for a lot of requirements to register, those are the places where she actually saw the biggest impact of an eviction in voting participation. So it's not just like those practical things. And the good part of that is that she says like, well, there's a solution to this. The solution is making it easier for everyone to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is the main goal of the Eviction Lab? Is it to gather this data and just put it out for publications to use and for people in government to use, so that they can use it as like a guiding light when they put laws together?
Yeah, so you have to think that maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, we didn't know a lot about evictions. In some cities, there was a little bit more conversation than in others, but a lot of people didn't even kind of think in their daily life about this issue. So the lab has tried to, like, the main goal is to shed light on this issue and provide data and knowledge about how big this is a problem, so that other people can work towards solutions. And that includes, of course, policymakers, everyone from your local council member to, the federal government, but also advocates, housing agencies, you and your neighbors that can realize, for example, that having a neighborhood that is becoming less and less affordable, that means that your fellow neighbor will suffer too, and not only will suffer losing their home, but also suffer issues with like their quality of life, the educational outcome of their children, and so many other impacts that are very well described in the book.
Yeah. So let's talk about, I want to give people some context, how big of a problem eviction is. Do you have some idea or way of sort of breaking down that for people that may not think about this in their day to day, like you said?
Yeah, so let's start a little bit before, and I think it's really important to understand that we are in a housing crisis in this country, and we've been for a long time, especially since the subprime crisis.
Hmm.
Access to housing has become more and more difficult. Home ownership has been something that a lot of Americans can't even dream of. Uh,
Hmm.
and the percentage that we pay of our income in housing has increased a lot.
Hmm.
So there's a few different ways on how to measure it, but actually today there was a report that came from the Joint Center for Housing Issues at Harvard, which is a really good housing research center, that more than 40 million households in the US, which is almost like a third of all of US households, spend more than 30% of their income on housing. It was an increase of 3.4 million households from 2019, the year before that we had data. So that's a huge number, and
Yeah.
we do see that more in the conversation. We see more people activated from about housing issues, and we of course might, just talking to friends, we might see that people are more stressed, more anxious about being able to afford the place where they live.
Hmm.
And this also, it's not just about affording, but I mentioned home ownership just now, and there's a big gap in terms of, like, if you manage to get that place, you're now putting money, you're creating equity, you're building
Hmm.
something. Even if you go through a downturn, you might have something that you can capitalize afterwards. For
Absolutely.
renters, that's not a possibility. And of course, renters are becoming more and more of a percentage of American society. Of course, low-income folks are overwhelmingly renters, and we
Hmm.
can say the same about Black and Latino communities, like that
Hmm.
tend to be more renters. And that's where we get to eviction. And like foreclosure, eviction happens really quickly.
Oh, it does.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a weird thing, because in a way, it's something that sometimes if you have a long-standing relationship with your landlord, you might see moving like in slow motion, like in the
Hmm.
few months where you realize that your wallet is getting, like, you have less money at the end of the
Hmm.
month, and you see that this is happening. But in the moment that someone files an eviction, depending on the laws in different states, it can happen in less than a month.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
yeah, things are varying, and there's like different things happening in terms of the policies, but especially in states in the South, for example, that have laws that are considered normally very landlord friendly. Yeah, an eviction can be really quick. So one of the things that the lab has done is creating these massive databases that now allows us to understand how many evictions happen in the country. And we know that in a typical year, landlords file around 3.6 million eviction cases.
Wow.
And that's a lot, of
Yeah.
course. But also there's a number that we don't know exactly how big it is, but we have reasons to believe that it's pretty big, of informal evictions. So evictions that don't happen through court, that just, like, either because the landlord didn't inform you well, or because you just decided to move when the landlord told you to,
Hmm.
those evictions are not counted. So
Right. Like if at the end of the lease they're like, I'm just not going to renew you,
yeah,
right? That would technically it is like an eviction, but it's not counted in that number, you're saying.
yeah, or you might not know your rights.
Okay.
You might try to avoid any other problems. I mean, we're just talking about stress. Imagine if you have issues, getting food, your car broke down, some health concern, and then on top of that, your landlord tells you, like, you have to go.
Hmm.
Are you going to go to court? I don't know.
No.
Like, I mean, it's a place that even for people that know how it works, it can be really difficult to understand and to navigate,
Right.
and just frightening.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, that's like a minimum number, and it's huge. And
Hmm.
yeah, that's where our concern grows from. Yeah, and of course, this number, you were talking about households. So multiply it by the amount of kids, spouses,
Right,
when
grandparents, yeah, people living with other people, yeah. Oh my goodness.
pets.
So, go
We
ahead.
have to talk about pets,
Yeah,
like
of course.
I don't think that I've ever seen like a proper paper or research done on this, but I see it constantly on the news. Whenever there's a housing crunch, the shelters get fully overcrowded because people, although they love their pets, probably most of them, they don't know what to do. I mean, being homeless with a pet, it can be very difficult because most or a lot of the shelters don't accept you with a pet.
Yeah, that's got to be a tough choice to make too. Yeah.
Can we talk? I know you've got a lot on your plate. You've got work, you've got friends, you've got family, pets, you've got the people that you make small talk with at the coffee shop or gym. You've got that bird that you see when you wake up every morning outside your window that you've projected things onto. Look at that bird. Doesn't even love its family. It's always by itself. You do that. Everyone does that. Point is, you've got a lot on your plate. Well, that's why there's Instacart, to take a little bit off your plate. Using Instacart, you search for all your favorite foods and things that you need from the grocery store, all online, all while you're looking at that bird, wondering why it hasn't called its mom. And they deliver it to you. They go to the store and do the shopping for you. And they can deliver it in as fast as an hour. And you can sign up by clicking the link in the description, wherever you're listening or watching. And that's a great way of supporting the show. So it's a great way of supporting this show. It's a great way to make your life a little bit easier, because we all know that you have so much going on, like wondering whether that bird judges you back.
Well, so where does this problem stem from, right? Here in Charleston, there's often a lot reported on the lack of affordable housing, and there's just not the amount of investment going towards affordable housing. Is that, I mean, whose fault is that ultimately? Is that on local governments to ensure that we're building more affordable more affordable housing? Right, there's this battle of like the free market versus the government making sure that there's enough housing to go around for people in low income jobs. Or even here in Charleston, it's discussed often how teachers can't afford living in this area compared to, let's say, like western parts of the state.
Yeah, I mean, the whodunit of this crime, it's a really complicated one, and it's probably, it goes all the way to us in many ways. So yes, we can talk about the lack of affordable housing. We're not building enough, a supply and demand, but there's all sorts of things in the history of this country that also contribute greatly to this. And we could have, I mean, there are experts that I'm sure are much better than me to talk about this, but we can talk about redlining, and how we created segregated cities that basically what they've done is like cornered poverty into some specific places, and that had impact later on affordability. We can talk of related to that zoning and how we zone to create unaffordable places, and we zone to not allow density, and to not allow multifamily buildings, or to not allow ADUs, small little houses that can go on the back of your house. All of that has an impact. We should also talk about like the investment on housing that this country has done over the last 30, 40 years. Like we haven't built public housing or Section 8 vouchers. They are always like very, very limited. Most people that technically qualify for them can't get them because they are limited. It's not like our food programs, for example, SNAP. If you qualify, you can get it. In this case, no. You can go and sign up for a waiting list in some places. Some places, the waiting lists are closed.
Or like lotteries, right? I've heard of lotteries for people to
varies. Like in some more progressive cities, they might have lotteries and they might have their own programs too, like in New York, but it's still really, really difficult. So yeah, it's just a matter of just look around your neighborhood and think like, when was it the last time that someone built public housing or some building that has some level of affordability?
And the ones that are built seem like they
yeah.
haven't been looked at or fixed up in since they were built, right?
Yes, so maintenance is a big issue. It varies a lot. I've seen some public housing authorities that actually have done really great jobs in their own places. Some, yeah, it varies a lot. There's like all kinds of organizations and institutions that measure this. But one big thing that I try to keep in mind all the time is that things shouldn't have to be this way. You look around, you travel, and there is in general like a lot of affordability problems globally, but there's a lot of countries that have solved this issue or that have done better than us, for sure.
Well, that's positive. I love to hear that. What countries are they, and what are they doing well?
I mean, you can see like Berlin, for example, in Germany, their rent restrictions and the way that they regulate the market and don't just see it as another commodity that I mean, sometimes we talk about housing and it feels like we're talking about candy or something,
Yeah.
when actually we should see it in the same way that we see health and yeah, I mean, there are things that should have a certain degree of regulation and also that should be available for everyone,
So you're saying that like Berlin puts in like caps certain prices and doesn't let you increase by certain amounts and stuff like that. So just like
yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm the best expert to talk about them, but the little that I know, yeah, there's regulations. You can't just do whatever. In terms of evictions are so much easy to execute here in the US than in any other country that I visited, in terms of time, in terms of so many little details. For example, one thing that happens a lot in the US is that let's say you're being evicted, but your housing has some kind of like health condition. There's mold, and you have had a leak for years. And the landlord never solved it. In many places, you can't make that part of the same case. So you have to start a separate case and think about this. You're barely making ends meet every month. And you're told that you would have to either go yourself or bring a lawyer and try to get your landlord to stop that.
It's not happening.
So yeah, it's impossible. And then, in terms of like the rights and understanding the rights and what capacity you have to, I don't know, there's a lot of efforts in some places for tenants to organize and to have some accountability about any, bad actors. And that's really hard to do here in the US. In most states, it varies a lot. But yeah, there's other ways of doing it. There's also like other countries in Asia and in Latin America that have done really interesting things in terms of like promoting home ownership, in terms of building more social housing, even in terms of working with the private sector. And we were talking before about, the way that we build our cities and our neighborhoods in terms of creating housing near places that are accessible by public transit, which has like this multiplying effect in terms of affordability and in terms of you spending less money because you're not also like paying for a car, you can go to your work, and that ends up maybe saving a lot of people from the possibility of going through an eviction, So yeah, there's a lot of things to do. Solutions here, there are so many. It's, I think, political will and funding what we sometimes don't have here.
Yeah. So I'm curious, does the Eviction Lab have advice that it puts out there, or is it just merely, it does. Okay. So what is the advice? I'd imagine it'd be both, because they want to just put the information out there. But if there are some things that the organization does recommend, I'd love to hear those.
Yeah, so for the first thing that is really important to say, we don't do advocacy. We're not allowed. And our role, more than anything, is to provide the data and the analysis so that other people, lawmakers, policymakers, advocates, can't find solutions and create solutions. But the research does show that some things work and that some things have a big impact. So I mean, there are so many. Whenever someone tells me like, what should we do? It's like, pick one of all these many because there are things like creating permanent rental assistance programs, for example, that when during the pandemic we had like probably the most ambitious housing investment that we've had in decades in this country, and it had an effect. So like everyone was thinking that evictions were gonna go through the roof during the pandemic.
I remember those news reports of like, it's coming.
And then we suddenly had the federal government stepping in and investing money, because this is an investment in like helping people that were going through a rough moment. The end result from our data is that millions and millions of evictions didn't happen that should have happened. And I mean, just think of the global impact of so many people not losing their homes. Now, so many cities are going through trying to figure out how we solve homelessness. That would have been much bigger problem today if we wouldn't have had that investment. Think about the impact on the education of so many kids. I mean, when I was in Texas reporting, I spoke with parents that would be bringing their kids to a McDonald's to use the Wi-Fi there. But imagine this to study in a moment where everyone was already going through a rough moment, with kids having classes on Zoom. And then on top of that, you're doing it in a loud place where you might not feel comfortable. And think of that kid trying to get complex algebra or whatever in his mind.
They're not, right? It's a tough, I mean, that's as uphill as it gets to.
So yeah, I mean, that's one thing. We could work so much more in like funding and promoting affordable housing through better zoning, getting rid of like complicated rules that make it difficult, putting more money into it, both at a state, local, or federal level. I mean, I could keep going for a long time. We could know better who are the landlords, which in most cases we don't know who is to blame or who is being like a great actor, because there are some landlords that are doing great stuff and that were really forgiving of debt and like negotiated with their tenants. But right now, like knowing who owns your building, sometimes it can be really difficult. I don't want to leave this just like on like all these like institutional things that we could do. I think there's a lot that we as regular citizens can do too. Because it's when someone's deciding to open housing that it's affordable in your neighborhood, not complain about it and actually support it. When someone, I mean, we have this thing here in this country, and I don't think it's just an American thing, but that we complain because we see tents, but we also complain because like some new building is coming, the NIMBY factor here is it's really strong, and we should like think about like what we need to do and the efforts that we need to do so that more of us can live happier and more fulfilling lives. Starting from
Americans have it so good that like you have to invent problems to complain about. It's like it's insane. So do you have any data that talks about, in let's just say a city that has a lot of evictions, does that have consequences for that locale? Like if there's a lot more evictions in one city versus another, does that city suffer lower employment numbers or higher crime, or are there any repercussions to having a lot more evictions?
Actually, I mean, I'm not sure if I can answer that one. It's a really good one, and I could ask the researchers in our team, because it's one that we should be looking at. I'm not sure if someone has looked at it.
Get back to me, and if you have that, and I can insert that information, or we can do a quick pickup.
I mean, I think one of the complicated things of answering that is that we create these lines that separate a city from another, but those are artificial, those are porous, right? And so like understanding how
Also, eviction itself may not be the causation, right? There may not be a direct line
So
between
isolating things
yeah,
and finding correlations, it's really complicated.
yeah.
What I would say is that I always thought that it was a really interesting exercise to see border places where there were like policies that were a little bit more tenant friendly.
Mm.
And it's really interesting to me how in this country, you can be just a few blocks away from having very, very different realities when you face an eviction. So I remember when I was in Texas, I spoke with someone that was going through a very rough moment. They actually had a really nice house, and during the pandemic and the layoffs, both parents lost their jobs, and they were living in Round Rock, which is a suburb of Austin,
Okay.
and it's literally like 5 minutes away from the Austin Travis County limit. So they were, I think they were, driving 2 minutes, 5 minutes away from like the neighboring area. And Austin and Travis County were famously one of the places in Texas and in the South with the most aggressive policies in terms of being like more supportive of tenants during the pandemic. So they created a very well-organized eviction moratorium. They had a pretty good rental assistance program, and judges were really tenant friendly, or at least a little bit more tenant friendly than the average judge. And it was crazy to me. This person ended up moving their family to a motel, and I actually visited them, and I mean, they were all packed in, those tiny living rooms, kitchenette kind of situations in our room, and trying to like making a lot of efforts to get back on their feet, both mentally, financially, physically, and just struggling a lot, because also like motels can be really, really expensive. The only reason you go to these places is because they don't check for your credit score, which, it's another consequence of an eviction. Your credit score and your records are impacted by it.
Oh my gosh, yeah, right. That's one question that every rental I've ever had has asked: have you had an eviction ever? Right. It's just it's a permanent mark against.
Yeah, we call it the Scarlet E, kind of like thing that it's etched into your body, and that it's really, really difficult to shake off. So I mean, that's kind of like one example of how big of a difference it can make if you're in one city or another.
Yeah, wow. One of life's mysteries is that birthdays always find me unprepared, catch me unprepared. I don't go on Facebook as much, so I don't notice them as much. But I want to express my love and appreciation for friends and family. That wasn't part of the copy, I'm just saying it. Year after year, month after month. Even when I see it coming, I'm not ready. Am I a jerk? Yes and no. Why do things have to be so black and white for you? But I've got great news, friends. Introducing monthly card subscriptions from the Cardist Studio. Join the service that delivers the card and the stamp that you'll need to your door. No more errands. Who wants more errands? I don't know why, but I'm starting to think of errands as a kid's name. Errands, go back to bed. Okay, but here's how it works. You choose your categories, from birthdays and celebrations to love and encouragement, or select their full collections and have those thank you notes and just because cards at the ready. Those ones are always so nice. Like when you get a card for doing something and it's just like a small little heads up or token of appreciation, it genuinely makes you feel really good. And best of all, you would never get caught cardless again. Let me repeat, you'll never get caught cardless again. Try to say that a bunch of times in a row. You'll never get caught cardless again. Monthly card subscriptions from as little as $8 per month for the card and the stamp. Delivered to you. TheCardistStudio.com, shop subscriptions. And you can use the promo code AnxietyPod for 15% off your originating order.
Well, we talked a little bit about individuals going through an eviction. I'm curious, are there resources out there so people can maybe learn a little bit more about their rights, or maybe there's lawyers who specialize in helping people who can't really afford to go through the system when they're being evicted? I'm curious what you know about what's out there.
Yeah, so I was thinking before this conversation, if you ask me about advice for tenants, and there's a lot to say there, but I think one of the first things that I would say, and this I'm actually taking this from a lawyer in Dallas, is to not go through this alone.
Mm.
In many places, there might be lawyers that can help you. In many places, those lawyers might be very limited, but in some places, there might be free legal aid for eviction cases.
Mm-hmm.
In those places that there aren't, there might be a community organization or a tenants union or some kind of place. And it can make a huge difference, because either if you get a lawyer or not, they will know this system a little bit more than you. They might find that, like, a little detail that you can get some kind of relief from, even if that doesn't mean, staying in that place. It might mean, gaining a month or two, and that can make a big difference, in terms of like learning what's going to be your next step, or how you can solve this thing. Yeah, so there's legal aid in many places, sadly not all over the US. Right now, I think we're having this moment where we're seeing these very different paths, where some cities are doing great advances. So creating, for example, what we call the right to counsel programs. If you are in a criminal case, you have the right to a lawyer. But if you're in an eviction case, this is part of civil law, so you don't have one. But there are a lot of cities that are adding this as a possibility. New York is the one that has done it for the longest, and that can be a huge difference.
Oh yeah.
And then on top of that, yeah, there might be a local rent assistance program. There are local community organizations, churches that have some funding to help people in need in one moment. So yeah, it's really good to be proactive. We have actually a website called justshelter.org. It's a sister site from us, and that one has like a list of organizations by state. Not like a complete list, but it's a pretty long list.
Yeah.
And that can be very helpful for someone needing someone. Yeah, and it's really important to go local, because like the scenario could be very, very different if you're, let's say, Los Angeles, or if you're in a suburb in the South or in the Midwest, where you might not have the same regulations, you might not have the same kind of like support or funding. Yeah, but there are resources out there. I wish that there would be like more available everywhere that you are nationally, but there are.
Yeah. Well, that's good to know that there is something. And yeah, right. What's the advice that you get anytime, someone is like arrested or brought in by the police? It's like the first words out of your mouth is, I want a lawyer, right? So why wouldn't you, not to equate the two things, but just trying not to do this thing alone, because it's for the similar reason. A lawyer knows the system. Someone, who helps with evictions would know the system and be able to help you, at least even getting another month, to help you just get your feet on the ground and process things, right? The mental fog that must come with this is got to be overwhelming,
Yeah. So there are so many also like moments where tenants don't go to court and the cases are decided by default for the landlord. And I actually, one silver lining that I had from the pandemic is that sadly many of the courts started doing remote
Oh,
hearings.
nice.
So I was able to jump into courts in San Antonio, in Houston, in Austin, Dallas, like from my desk, and I could see that there was a very radical change in the attitude of the judge and in the conversation when people were represented by a lawyer. Made like a huge difference. There's also like in a lot of cities are starting to play with these mediation programs, and like that's another great alternative that people have. Philadelphia and Chicago are one of like the best examples, but that allows you to have that conversation that actually sometimes happens in court, sometimes it doesn't, but have it before court. So it saves money and time for the landlord and for the tenant. And sometimes you can find some kind of solution, a payment plan, some kind of other way, and that's a great opportunity. Sadly, it's not available nationwide, but there are a lot of places that are doing it, and the federal government actually put more money towards like testing these opportunities in other cities. So that's another possibility that people have.
That's amazing. Yeah. Well, I'm curious, do you have any information that projects into the future? Does your organization suggest that evictions could increase over let's say, the next 5-10 years?
It's we try not to do that. It's really complicated, and we are very, very cautious. I mean, the things that we are keeping track of are rent prices and vacancy rates. And according to some of the websites that keep track of rent prices have gone down a little bit, but in the overall landscape, we're still seeing a country that in the last 5 years, rents have increased a lot. So
skyrocketed. Yeah.
We don't know how big this decrease is going to be, what impact that's going to have with evictions and, in general, housing instability. But housing markets normally are very profitable, and rents tend to go up in general. So, and you have to also think about this holistically, right? And housing is one item, one of the biggest items in your expenditures, in your budget. For most Americans, is the biggest one. But then you're also like paying more for all sorts of things, with the levels of inflation, and there are with the interest rates that we have now, it's becoming more difficult also to access home ownership. Yeah, there's a lot of factors, and all I can say is that we're gonna keep track of what's going on, and that in particular in evictions, what we've seen in the last year is that evictions have gone up in every single city that we track, and that in many of those cities, I would say like half of them, they've gone to numbers that were bigger than before the pandemic. So we didn't go back to a normal, whatever that means.
Right.
A normal that was already a crisis. We went back to eviction rates that are even worse than before the pandemic. So that's I mean, hopefully something good happens and that trend doesn't keep going up, but yeah, we don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's encouraging that at least your organization is looking into this stuff, because without that data, it just stays like a silent problem, right? And shining a light on it is very important to eventually, hopefully, solving it.
Yeah, you have to think that so many people that make decisions in this country and that write stories and so on are homeowners. So this actually becomes this impossible, like invisible problem for so many of them. Yeah. So like having this data clearly, like it's something that allows not only us, but so many other, we hear constantly of like journalists, policymakers, people in like the staffs of different politicians that are keeping tabs of like what's going on in their cities. So yeah, we encourage everyone to check our data. The people can visit evictionlab.org, and in our eviction tracking system, we have 31 cities and 9 states now. Sadly, we don't have data for every single place in the US, but we have our eviction map, which has data for every single county in all the country. From 2000 to 2018. So that's kind of like if they want to see how things have worked in general in terms of evictions.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's been concerning and eye-opening, and as you would expect a conversation about eviction would be. I'm wondering if there's anything else you would like to mention, or anything you think I'm missing, or any other like websites or social media you think people should be aware of.
Oh yeah, I mean a lot of things. I just like you when you invited to me to this. The framing was a little bit about like the anxiety and the stress that an eviction can bring. And I think it's worth mentioning, it might be a little bit obvious, but it's worth mentioning that housing, it's such a key aspect physically, but also kind of like symbolically for all of us. And we kind of tend to forget about it.
Definitely take it for granted in a lot of cases too.
Yeah. And it's a mix of something that we need emotionally in so many different levels. It's like, it's our place of love. It's a place of shelter. It's a place of comfort. So when you are stressed about it, you're stressing about all of those things, plus all the anxiety of that a bill that you can't pay gives you, you know? So it's just like this key aspect that we should always remember how lucky we are for the ones that have it, and how so many Americans struggle to actually get to this basic point that if you have it, it impacts positively in ways that we don't realize, because it's like breathing. Your health, your mental health, your finances, your again, the education of your kids, your friendships, your relationship to community, the quality of the food that you can cook.
It's a baseline, it's the foundation of a healthy life, right?
Yeah, and also like if you lose it, then you go to this chaos and this whirlwind of things that gets you into this fight or flight mode that might be really difficult to get out.
Absolutely.
And that it scars you for life in many occasions, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I've been laid off before, and I still feel like the scars of that. Being evicted from a house or your living space, 100 times worse. So I can only imagine what that must feel like. And yeah.
So yeah, for me, that's a goal for all of us, to be like super involved in these issues, to inform ourselves, to see what's going on, and to think about how we can make our cities or neighborhoods a place where everyone can have this particular aspect, housing, as something that it's safe and that they don't have to be constantly anxious and stressing about. And ask ourselves, what can we do about it?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And let me know if you talk to the researchers and they have anything to add, and we can do a little pickup there.
Yeah. So you mentioned kind of crime. What else?
It was like crime, unemployment. I don't want to limit it to just that. I don't know if there's other implications, but yeah, it was just like crime, unemployment, economic development. Does it just sort of, if you think of eviction, right, using the metaphor of the foundation of a life, but if there's multiple people, the city itself on the aggregate, there may not be a foundation for a thriving community.
Yeah. One thing that I would add in that sense is that although we think that evictions should be more common in these very highly unaffordable markets, so let's think about San Francisco, LA, New York, what we actually see in our data is that the places with the higher level of evictions are places like where you live,
Yep.
So in the Sun Belt, and southern states. Again, correlation is not causation, but those are places that have high levels of poverty, high levels of inequality, that have laws that tend to favor landlords a lot, that tend to have very little protections for renters, and not a lot of options or resources for people that are struggling. So yeah, that's one thing that I would say on that sense. But I'm gonna ask our researchers and let you know what they say about it. I know that we've talked about crime at some point, but I don't remember if someone actually did something about it.
Yeah. Okay.
We try to be very careful about what we know and what we don't know.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, like we were saying before, the causation there may not be the line to draw from one to the other, and especially with crime, there's people are already being told crazy things about evictions and poor people, right? That you don't want to incite more of that, right? If it's not the case.
Yeah. Well, crime statistics, that's a whole world, and it's super complicated and complex.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Perception and crime, it's like, yeah, I've reported a little bit on that, and it's a mess, and people just like believe something, but actually realities are different and so on. So
of course, yeah. Well, thanks again for your time, and I'll be in touch.
So yeah, there we have it. Thank you so much to Juan. Thank you so much to the Eviction Lab for everything that they do and their time. I'd certainly be interested in hearing listeners' thoughts on this episode and how it makes you feel and what questions you have. I definitely also recommend going to the Eviction Lab's website, playing around with the interactive tools. I've learned a lot doing that. And that stuff is pretty eye-opening. So before I get to the weird thing causing me anxiety this week, which is actually a news story that I just read, I want to remind you of the Buy Me a Coffee link. It's in the description, and it's just a way to make a donation to the show, or you can think of it like a tip. Then there's the Pure Spectrum CBD company, my partnership with them. I use a ton of their different products, and I really get a lot of use out of them. I'm definitely going to use they have these like relaxing like bath powder, and I will be using that tonight. Remember how I'm just a middle-aged man who played too much hockey. We're still hung up on that. And then if you want to sign up for home delivery for groceries, you can do that through Instacart, who has the link in the description. By signing up for Instacart, that way you're telling Instacart that this show sent you, which helps support the show. And then there's the Cardist Studio, who offer the promo code AnxietyPod for 15% off your first order. So yeah, thank you so much to the sponsors, and supporting them helps support me. Okay, weird thing causing me anxiety this week. I'm just gonna read the headline: Cooked bats seized by German officials near Belgian border. Why? Why are we eating bats? And there's a picture. There's not much meat on bats, so you're not even getting that much food. I can't tell if they were like smoked or like boiled or it's just the whole bat. It's not like breast meat or something like that. It's just cooked. They just cooked the whole fucking bat. Not to mention rabies, coronavirus. Let's stop eating weird animals. Let's stop. It also doesn't seem like this is being done by someone who is like really hungry, because it's like there's a million of them in there. Not a million. It's like 30. A million. I just don't understand it. So this guy was trying to cross over a border in Europe from Belgium into Germany, and he had a bunch of fish, like a ton of fish, like literally a ton of fish, and under it he had hidden these cooked up bats. It's almost like, why aren't you selling drugs like a normal person? Like, where's the weed? Or if as weed becomes legal, people just start getting into boiled bats that they're selling. Yeah, it's just terrifying from what the hell is going on with humanity point of view. And a bonus weird thing giving me anxiety this week is that I bought a pole saw to help trim some trees on my property. And my daydreams have just been me like cutting off fingers, like accidentally, with this pole saw. Well, maybe that just means I'm going to respect the tool and be super cautious with it, you know? Because why else would I make myself crazier than I am? Well, I actually have to end here because I actually am about to see a new therapist, so let's see how it goes. As always, thank you so much for listening, and enjoy.